Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for having me, and thank you especially to the site for inviting me on out today. My name is Ian Mumpton, and I'm relatively recently arrived out at Johnson Hall State Historic Site as the Interpretive Programs Assistant. Before that, I was out at Schuyler Mansion for quite a while. One of the things that I really wanted to emphasize today as I talk about what we're looking to do at Johnson Hall for commemorations of the 250th anniversary of the Revolution is to approach this from two angles. First, much of our history at Johnson Hall is technically, by date, pre-revolution. Not all, I'm going to be talking about that in a little bit more in a moment, but a lot of what we're doing is kind of setting the stage. What's happening in the lead up to the conflict before bullets start flying, because this was not just a military encounter. This was a span of conflict growing out of decades of conflict, decades of cooperation, decades of interaction between different cultural groups. And also to talk about one of the things we're kind of trying to implement as a bit of a shift is thinking about Johnson Hall less as a location on the frontier. Some of the signage we were talking about recently in some of our exhibit text had been referring to it as a frontier, but in conversations with our site manager Wade Wells, Mary Patton with the interpretive unit and others, we're really kind of embracing the idea of Johnson Hall as a location on the borderlands between empires, be that British, French, Haudenosaunee, especially we're located right in the heart of Mohawk territory. Also, Dutch cultural influence. While technically Johnson Hall, built in 1763, is long after the official turnover of what had been New Netherland to the British to become New York, culturally speaking, there's still a massive Dutch impact there. So, thinking about this as a site where we can really share a wide variety of voices from the borderlands in a place where all of these cultural groups are interacting. And that really, it's a phrase that gets thrown around a lot in some ways, of crossroads of cultures. Johnson Hall very much is that, to our very fiber of our being. When we think about the stories that we have to share there, we have the story of the Johnson family, which was an Anglo-Irish Mohawk family. Sir William Johnson is Anglo-Irish, born in Ireland, comes over here to the colonies, and while he ends up as superintendent of Indian Affairs a little bit later in life, he is deeply involved in Native American exchange, trade, diplomacy, and military action right from the start, from a very, very young age there. And by the time that he's actually living at Johnson Hall, his wife, Molly Brandt, she is Mohawk, and she is not only is she Mohawk, she is a prominent culture keeper for Mohawk residents of the area, one of the prominent figures of the Revolution. And this is a family that is growing up, for their children, growing up with both European, Anglo-Irish influence and Mohawk influence between language, cultural traditions, garb, and the social connections that they're making, the community that they are involved in. The house itself really holds two simultaneous functions and is seen in two simultaneous ways at the time, as a Georgian gentleman's seat and as a Mohawk woman's house. The site itself becomes kind of a social and political space for a lot of colonial European leadership at that point, but it's also one of the prominent council fire locations and trade sites for Six Nations and other indigenous groups. Sir William Johnson is involved in diplomatic and trade efforts as far west as, with representatives from the Sioux via his agents in Detroit, and much further south into the Ohio Territory and throughout. So when we talk about diplomatic activity happening at the house, we're really talking about not just European diplomatic activity, European leadership meeting there, and not just about Native American and Indigenous leadership meeting and coordinating there, but these groups interacting with each other on a daily basis in many cases. It was also in close proximity to prominent Mohawk communities, specifically what's often referred to as the Upper and Lower Castle, or Tiononderoga and Canajoharie. But it's also a place that is being worked by tenant farmers, in many cases, of Scottish, English, German, Dutch ancestry. They're all part of this story too, and they're, especially as we look forward to the commemoration of the Revolution, where they fall on sides of that conflict are going to be very different from one another in some ways, but also strikingly different in their relationship with the Johnsons, for many of them, than tenant families in other regions. We'll talk about that a little bit more. The site is also home at that time to at least 40, and we suspect we're going to find many more references to names and unnamed individuals, at least 40 enslaved Africans from various cultures. One of the things that Wade and I have been talking about recently is references to some of the names of the people enslaved at the site. We believe that while there are very few references to elements of traditional garb or their location of their birth, that their names, for those who we have names, are going to be able to give us clues as to their origins or their family and ancestry's origins, specifically to the individuals, a man named Quacko and a man named Quashi. So we're looking forward to being able to have some more information there. But Johnson Hall was also in close proximity to free black communities and free black residents of the Mohawk Valley, especially a group referred to as the Willigree Negroes. During the Revolution itself, it's a bastion of loyalism. I mentioned the tenant farmers being very much split, in many areas as to which side of that conflict they're going to come down on. While, as I said, I worked at Schuyler Mansion for many, many years, Philip Schuyler's tenants hate him. To be perfectly blunt, they were not fond of him in many cases. Could have to do with little things like the relationship revolving around, seizing a wood stove in the middle of February when a guy was behind on rent, mostly because he had to spend the money on medicine for his child, things of that sort. And so Philip Schuyler refers to, at various points, that he's afraid to go to the back of his property because his tenants are going to whisk him away to Canada for a 2-penny reward is about all that it would take. After Sir William Johnson dies in 1774, 2 years after that, we'll talk about this a little bit more as well in a bit, but 2 years after that, when his son John is evicted from the home and has to retreat to Canada to raise Loyalist forces there, a huge number of the tenants of this family go with them. And that itself is kind of a fascinating distinction in the relationship here at this site versus some of the other sites that I've had the opportunity to work at. And we talk about, our whole history is something that we can look back to our past, to our roots. We can identify a wide variety of narratives, some of which have been told and shared, others which have not. It's important to see, at Johnson Hall especially, that it is seen in its own time as an important crossroads of culture, and often as an intentional crossroads of culture. Sir William Johnson, at least in terms of native diplomacy, is creating this home with the intention of it being a center for diplomatic and mercantile exchange. In other ways, it was not intentionally intended as a crossroads of culture. For instance, the people enslaved there, Sir William is not building it with their cultural influence and their cultural expression in mind, but we see people in the time recognizing their role in the site and also recognizing cross-cultural connections there, referring specifically, for instance, part of our ongoing research right now into clothing of the enslaved at the site, numerous references at the hall and in the local area to the enslaved wearing traditional or trade native garb, specifically leggings, match coats, which is the blanket wrap, either in match coat form or sewn into other garments. A fellow from Schoharie, who in his runaway advertisement is when he attempts to self-liberate, he runs with a pack on his back that is described specifically as having a wampum belt for the strap of the tump line of that pack. A man in Albany by the name of Jacob, when he escapes from one of Sir William Johnson's British Indian Department commissary agents, George Ray, when he flees, he is wearing, specifically described in the advertisement, green Indian leggings, a blanket coat, and a knit red cap. He also takes with him his dog Venture, which just and whenever I reread that description, I just think about Lovato, what you've talked about with making sure that there is room in our understanding of the past for the enslaved to smile, and the fact that this guy takes his dog with him is one of my favorite small points, small facts in that narrative. But these are all some of the stories and some of the perspectives that we're constantly trying to express individually, independently, but also where they overlap, where they support each other. I was talking with a friend actually last night on my way home from work, and we were talking about some of the main cultural strands at Johnson Hall, being European colonial families there, Indigenous families and groups, African families and groups. And how we started out talking about, this is a three-legged stool, and if you aren't interpreting all three of those, that stool's going to fall down. But as we talked, we started talking a little bit more about it, and it's not just that it's a three-legged stool. You have to imagine this as a stool where every leg of this stool is built of a bundle of rods. And you may have this leg is primarily the indigenous leg, this leg is primarily the African leg, this leg is primarily the European colonial leg, but every one of those legs is made up of a combination of rods of all of these groups interacting with each other. And if you aren't fully embracing each one of those, not only have you lost a full leg, you've weakened the other two that are still there, because these stories have to support each other. Actually, let me back up for a second. The image that's right here, this is actually an early 20th century painting of Johnson Hall. And Wade and I were just talking yesterday about how neat it is to see some of the historical detail in this. There's a lot that is historically inaccurate in this painting. Some of the, especially some of the indigenous garb, some of the paint on the house, things of that sort. But as early as the early 20th century here, what we see here is a painting that is representing all three of these, broadly speaking, cultural groups that we're talking about here. You've got Sir William and officers of the British Indian Department meeting and counseling with Native leadership, but even in a time period where, African Black history is not as embraced in our revolutionary and colonial narrative, there are representations of the enslaved at Johnson Hall in this image. We're also looking forward to being able to embrace this, these forms of interpretation with new signage, new images, new interpretation. This is one of our favorite ones that's kind of been guiding some of our conversations, and we are going to be have already actually included in a new exhibit space. It's called A Good Day for Trade. It's not specifically of Johnson Hall, but this really does kind of capture a lot of the sort of cultural exchange and cultural trade at this point that we see on these borderlands and in areas whose history relates to the hall itself. So in terms of looking at the site through the lens of the revolution and the 250th anniversary of that conflict, as I said, a lot of what we talk about there is the buildup to the revolution, but our revolutionary history really starts with death. As bleakly depressing as that sounds, Sir William Johnson died July 11, 1774, and this immediately threw New York, but especially the Mohawk Valley and the region where we're based, into conflict and into turmoil. As Superintendent for Indian Affairs, Sir William had pursued a very specific series of policies that had earned him respect from both colonial British officials and the Crown, and from Native leaders, specifically most strongly amongst the Mohawks, but other groups as well. And not only did he die this year, but he actually died while in treaty, collapsed in the middle of the treaty, leaving many matters not as fully discussed or settled as he had hoped going into that. So his influence is split pretty early in that in what we would consider the broad revolutionary phase, between Guy Johnson, his son-in-law, Daniel Klaus, another son-in-law, and another one of his top representatives, and his son John Johnson, or Sir John Johnson, in terms of official influence and official authority for the British Indian Department. At first, he considers having his son step into the role, determines that he's not quite ready for that, and then has to determine how exactly Guy Johnson and Daniel Klaus are going to be carrying on his legacy. This is also at the same time that, and I've been working on the pronunciation, so I hope that I hope I'm getting closer. Gonwansetsieni, or Gonwansetsieni, Molly Brant departs the hall for Kananjahari at this point, at the upper castle, where she sets up a trade house and continues her influence, especially amongst the Mohawks and other members of the Six Nations. Now, as the revolution kicks off, Sir William is dead in July of 1774, and within just several months, you have revolutionary committees forming in the Mohawk Valley. This is a rapid state of transition. In May of 1775, Guy Johnson, Daniel Claus, and Thayendanegea Joseph Brant depart the valley. Many of them headed to Canada, to Niagara. They're going to be working in favor of the British war effort and native diplomacy throughout that span. But they're gone from the area, they're gone pretty early. Now they will come back. They will come back with a vengeance throughout the course of the conflict, but their physical presence in the valley really does not extend into the war as far as a fixed permanent residence. The following year, in May of 76, Sir John Johnson is driven from Johnson Hall. His wife, Polly, or Mary Johnson, is captured and, on orders from Philip Schuyler, taken to Albany at that point, where she is held captive and threatened to be turned over to the mob to be torn apart in the streets on at least 2 occasions by Philip Schuyler as a means for trying to prevent her husband from rallying Mohawk and other Six Nation warriors to fight on behalf of the British in New York. After the battle at Oriskany, Molly Brand is driven from Canajoharie as well. She receives warning from Nicholas Herkimer that, well, there's not going to be much more that I can do for you. You'd better get out of here real quick. People are coming looking for revenge. And so she departs first for Onondaga, and then later she will end up in Canada as well. One of my favorite points with her in this matter is to point out that in 1785, she returned to New York for a visit to Schenectady, and the loss that was felt in terms of native diplomacy by the new rebel government, or I guess United States government by that point, was so severe that they actually offered her financial compensation to return to New York, which she rejected with, quote, the utmost contempt. Over the course of the conflict, a big part of our narrative, part of our history, is both Loyalists and Mohawks of the area around Johnson Hall being largely dispossessed. And a lot of this ties in with my former site out there at Schuyler Mansion. A lot of those land efforts and a lot of that dispossession is originating from emphasis in Albany, and specifically kind of with the, referred to here as Albany's mercantile gentry, but really that's the Schuylers, Van Rensselaers, Livingstons, one big interrelated group of landholders that have very keen interest in the Mohawk Valley at this point and in land claims and land possession out there. So in terms of our Loyalist history at the site, we've got a number of Loyalist regiments that form from many of these tenants out in the valley at that point, many of them forming in Canada, but drawn from tenant residents of the area, including the 84th Highlanders, King's Royal Regiment, Butler's Rangers, and many of these Loyalist forces are going to play a major role in the Battle of Johnstown, 1781, last major battle of the American Revolution in the Northern Theater. We also are talking a lot about Mary Watts Johnson. We'll be talking more about her, the short version, so that I don't go on too long talking about her, because she's one of my favorite people from the time period to talk about. While she was a prisoner in Albany, she was able to collect military intelligence on rebel activity in the community, passing it through both Native and British Indian Department contacts to British forces in New York City and Canada, make herself enough of a thorn in the side of the rebels that every organization in Albany tries to pass her off to somebody else to have to keep track of, and then eventually is able to escape about 70 to 80 miles overland to rejoin her husband behind British lines. We also have a lot of really neat new information about Black Loyalists in Johnstown. And earlier Michael was talking about the Dunmore's Proclamation and the Phillipsburg Proclamation. However, on May 17th of 1775, right at the very start, we have Sheriff Alexander White and Justice of the Peace William Biddle, noted in rebel revolutionary proceedings in Albany. Testimony is given that they have publicly sworn to, quote, protect and defend all slaves and Negroes that would resort unto them and put themselves under their protection. This is right from the start. This is not the first time that military forces in North America have offered freedom as an opportunity, to disrupt their enemy's activities, but they are. But this is the first time that I've at least seen during the Revolution. As I said, this is right after Lexington and Concord, where this is being publicly proclaimed. It's not a published proclamation the way that Phillipsburg Proclamation would be, but this is actionable information. People enslaved in Albany and Schenectady start escaping in large numbers at this point. We see numerous references to them operating out of the Johnstown area, and rebel leadership in Albany freaks out about this big time. We see them really cracking down on any suspicion of enslaved rebellion really from this point forward. Specifically, Nicholas Klaus, who Jesse Serfilippi mentioned as one of the people to escape from the Schuyler's during the war. After he escapes from Philip Schuyler, he is referenced in the document known as the Book of Negroes, sailing to Canada with Sheriff White in 1783. So this story of black loyalist escape attempts and resistance really is very firmly rooted to the core of our revolutionary history at Johnson Hall. So as far as what we're doing right now to interpret the revolution, we are really working to respond to our communities. We're revitalizing a lot of our living history programming. This is an image from this past October, Memento Mori out at Johnson Hall, spooky storytelling program, but even that, the very first story shared in that was about the Johnson flight from Guy Park Hall there. So really working that element into everything that we're doing. Doing a lot more with trying to revitalize our school and community outreach. This is images from our trade bail program, which has been going on for many, many years and is still requested year after year after year by school groups for either on-site or outreach programming. We've also been working, especially this past year, again, strengthening our connections with Indigenous communities. This is a page from the Ganawage Survival School's brand new student newspaper, chronicling their trip to the Mohawk Valley. And for many of these groups, we worked with groups from Ganawage and Thayendanegea this year, and people from both groups were referring to this very much as a spiritual and cultural homecoming, and that we're looking forward to working much more closely with them in the future. So we're right here, kind of in the center. Center there with the red shutters and the White House behind everybody. That's them right at Johnson Hall. That's actually a photograph taken in the back courtyard, and really moving, powerful moment. The students from the school at the end of their trip were selecting their new student government for the upcoming year, and they chose this location where Native treaties were conducted for the entire time that Sir William resided in this house where the council fire burned. They chose that as the space where they were going to select their student body along the same along the same lines as their tribal government operates, and on traditional leadership, selecting clan mothers and war chiefs to lead the student body. We also have some new exhibits coming in, new exhibit on diplomacy and trade, which I thought that image was going to pop up there, but I'm sure it will in a moment. Also new research on cross-cultural clothing of the enslaved and free black loyalists, which I mentioned before in terms of a lot of evidence of native garb being worn by the enslaved. In terms of that clothing, it seems that some of it is being issued, but to your question earlier, we were talking earlier, Lovato was commenting on clothing as a form of, different clothing worn at different times and different forms of expression. It seems that a lot of this clothing is stuff that the enslaved are seeking out themselves, trading what they have, what they can get in order to have. So we're going to be exploring this as a form of not only cross-cultural clothing, but personal expression on the part of the enslaved in the form of portable possessions, things that they will take with them when they go places. This is from the new exhibit in the house, or in our exhibit space there. We are also working to try to create new positions for interpreters of colonial African history and Native American history, because this is work that we need to be sharing, that we need to be supporting, and making sure to amplify the voices of others and other historians and other interpreters in this work. And we are also looking forward to, in our master plan, has not gone out for review yet, but in our master plan, plans for constructing historically sympathetic interpretive structures, including a reference from Sir William's papers to when he had in 1772, I want to say this one was, a reference to the building of a log house of 100 feet long for the reception of Indians. And our hope would be that this will be both an interpretive structure on the site to help people understand the layout of the site, but also a space for cultural and historical programming, and a place to be able to host events and presenters. Our big commemorations coming up: the evacuation of Guy Park in 2025, the confiscation or theft of Johnson Hall in 2026. It's going to be a large program, kind of one of our big capstone pieces for commemorating the revolution. There have been recreations of that before, but we're really looking to expand the scope and really knock this one out of the park. Highlighting local Loyalists and ongoing programming recognizing Loyalist and Indigenous diaspora and dispossession over the course of that conflict and what that conflict meant for many of the people who would have called that region home at the time. So. Shameless plug for our holiday open house, December 7th and 8th. Come by and ask me about it later. It's going to be cool. And that's what I've got.